Hello, everyone. So, I have been having a time of my life listening to different people talk about Cheyenne Bryant, and I thought there was a unique spin that no one is addressing that I'm coming to you. So, today I want to talk about higher education within the United States, because then you can get a better picture of how something kind of like this can happen. So let's start off with I'm gonna try to be brief. I have a timer. So let's start off with higher education really always had a two-prong space, right? So the two-prong space was it was a private corporation, and that's where Harvard started. The ingenious of Harvard being a private organization and being a private corporation. Um, Being a private corporation is that uh, it did not have to ask permission from Great Britain. Historically, because the United States was a colony, that um, because the United States was a colony, Great Britain was, um, universities kind of started, mm, colleges started in the United States through permission of asking Great Britain. And so that's how you got places like University of Virginia, and you had some of the older universities that began. Uh, but once we fast forward, so you have the colonial universities, which are your Ivy Leagues, and those colonial universities that are in Northeast, the further south that you get is Princeton. Those universities were founded before the American Revolution, and that being Harvard University, Columbia University, you have uh, University of Pennsylvania, and Princeton University, and Dartmouth College, and um, and Cornell. Now, I think it's important to note that Harvard and Yale University, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, all were colleges. Um, Yale is a different story, but I'm not here to get into the founding of the particular and the fights between the colleges because Yale comes out of Harvard, and you can put that in the chat if you want to know more, and I'm happy to talk more about that. But we're not here for that. So you have those colonial colleges, the remnants of Columbia and Harvard being listed as a college and somewhat Yale, it still lies and lingers in the university setting as a whole. But the notion of it being a university, what the difference between a college and a university is that a university is a research institution, whereas college is supposed to be more focused on non-research, liberal arts kind of space. It's supposed to be offering 2 or 4 year degrees and in some cases graduate degrees, but it was supposed to always be in the liberal arts. Over the years, these definitions have shifted and changed because mm, you do have colleges kind of changing their mindset on what they may offer. They may offer a little bit more graduates. They do may offer more graduate studies, not a PhD though, but they will offer other things like in the sciences. Let's fast forward. So then you have another wave of colleges, which we call them after the the American Revolution. So you had a great deal of universities that started to start popping up after the American Revolution. You no longer had to get permission from anyone. And then this notion of accreditation is something that's actually more of a nuanced perspective because accreditation agencies have actually not been around for very long. And I think this is an important thing to note. Um, and because one of the bigger, larger issues in the United States when it comes to higher education is how do you know for sure it is a more recognized institution versus it not being a recognized institution? And the thing that universities wanted to protect their brand, and that's when they started to consider in the early 1900s accreditation, right? And so, um, taking part, I'm fast forwarding. Let me go back, and I'm gonna come back to that accreditation piece. So you had American, right after American Revolution, you had this influx of more universities that began to start popping up. And but the biggest, well, and then you had your next layer of the American, especially in the South, the American after this American Civil War, you had a huger influx of colleges, mainly in the South, because not only were you having formerly enslaved people needing to create a different skill, but you also had former groups, either former slaveholders' children, or you also had just white children who are now looking to get a degree because now they can have a skill. Before the Civil War, you had a great deal of higher education was really only held for people who were more affluent slave owners, and they would send their children either up north to college, and then you had some of the rising of, they were, you know, uh, Princeton University was, gained its name and notoriety within the South as one who would help start other universities in the South. So you had University of North Carolina. So then young men would be able to go to school in the South, and because a lot of uh, slaveholders was really not excited about sending their kids too far up to the north because they thought because when they would come back home, they'd have a they struggled too much to be a slaveholder, depending on the school they went to. So they really were like, oh, and then also not just that, it wasn't even that they were concerned about being a slaveholder, even if they were fine with being continuing the practice of slavery, they weren't interested in being a part of the agricultural space. They wanted to get different professions. They wanted to become a doctor, a lawyer, all of these other professions. So then it made this agricultural concept and the agricultural economy really threatened. And so sending children to universities that had a better mindset, a better concept of what the South was like, was what they favored. And so Princeton helped develop those concepts. And so, like I said, University of North Carolina started popping up. You had your Duke University kind of beginning to pop up. So you began to have Southern universities. But Southern universities didn't really explode until after the Civil War, to where a lot of people needed to come up with a skill. This is where the HBCUs took a beat. So HBCUs were largely founded, the majority of them were founded by white people. Very few of them were founded by Black people. This is important because it wasn't actually until the 1960s, between the 1960s and then it pushes all the way into the 1980s, that you began to have a radical reshift of what HBCUs were beginning to look like. People were demanding that HBCUs had more Black professors. They have to have more, not just Black people in these spaces of, in some of the service spaces, but they wanted professors. They wanted the curriculum to reflect more concepts of African American. They wanted to see themselves in the curriculum. Imagine going to a HBCU and you still don't see yourself in any of the curriculum. You don't see any other professors. Why is that? Or even the presidents, or even the dean of women. All of these things was kind of absent. Why would that be absent? Well, because the assumption of when all of this was created was that Black people were not civilized enough and they needed to be and cultured and reskilled. And it's not just white people that believed that. It was also some Black people that also believed it. So they had all these extra rules. They had dress codes. They had, all of these particular facets. And some of this stuff still lives on to this day. There are some schools, I'm not here to name names. There are some schools that mandates etiquette classes. There are some schools that will provide undergrads with business cards, with, certain tools that would help them have an advantage on a professional space. Now, we can talk forever about if this is appropriate, if this is not appropriate, etc. But I will say this is that um, HBCU serves a large demographic of people that probably would not have gone to college because sometimes the admission is they'll admit more people on a grace period to where they have to see if they can perform or not. Um, so they give them a contingency. They don't call it that, but I'm going to use it, a contingency to perform. You also have a lot of HBCUs that pop up in spaces historically and currently that there are no community colleges. This presents another issue. HBCUs, when they were founded, up until for the very large part, until I would even argue to the 1960s, 1970s, where a lot of these HBCUs were giving out degrees such as we call them an AB degree. An AB degree which I am stunned when I see somebody with an AB degree in 2026. An AB degree is the equivalent of an AA degree. However, the difference is that an AB degree is something that they did take 4 years to go, 3 to 4 years to finish. But predominantly white institutions would look at these degrees and think that they're not the equivalent of a BA degree because a lot of these students did not go to high school. And that's not because they didn't want to, there was no high school. And so they would go into a HBCU. So HBCU served as a purpose of almost teaching high school to in college. So if even thinking about Martin Luther King, we talk about Martin Luther King going to Morehouse when he was 13, 14 years old. But that's because of the way that the high school system was in Georgia for Black people. And he's of a certain class. He was a middle class student, but that is not an anomaly. And when we look at some of the age ranges of some of our HBCUs, depending on when students were going, it's not unheard of that some of them were on the older side, especially right after slavery. So even when I think about my founders of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, many of them were on the older side. They were not traditional age. The notion of traditional age is really a nuanced concept. And I would argue it has to be after I would I wouldn't say as late as the 80s, but definitely like in the 70s, 60s and 70s is when we really got into the mindset of a traditional age. But depending on where you were, like right after post-slavery, if you're that first generation out of slavery, a lot of them were not 18, 19-year-olds going to college. They were older because they were going to high school at a later age, an earlier age to be able to get into an HBCU. But it also, like I said, depends on location. And then there was another generation after that, like the King generation, where if you were in certain parts of the South, they did not have some of them did not have an equipped high school. And so they partnered with the HBCUs, and that's how they were able to shift over. And because of that mentality, a lot of predominantly white institutions would admit these students and they would get an AB degree from fill in the blank university, and then they would transition over to a bachelor's degree someplace else. Now, I say all this because there were some HBCUs. So this is why there's hierarchy. There's some HBCUs, such as Howard University, that did not have that. So the HBCUs that has always been looked upon as the more prestigious has been Fisk and Howard because they did not have trade programs. This is the reason why Hampton, it's Hampton Institute, and Hampton Institute was founded with teaching trades and, this kind of trades and other degrees, but they also had that AB concept, Tuskegee, all of these. And so therefore you had Fisk and Howard that always had, if they graduated from there, they wouldn't need to take any addition. Predominantly white institutions would argue they didn't need to take any additional courses when they would get in order to get a BA someplace else, unless they were doing a whole different degree, but they didn't need anything else. It was just that. Okay. I hope you're with me. So this is part 99%, 100% of the reason why you have this hierarchy of here are some of the HBCUs that are so prestigious that it looks so highly upon. And then there's all these other grata where different tiers. Why the Howard University is looked upon one way, whereas Hampton Institute, which is now Hampton University, is looked upon in a different way. Whereas you have, there are some who has been able to elevate themselves. This is why you have Spelman University that has used to be Spelman College that has always been looked upon some way. Think of the founding. It was Rockefeller, whereas Morehouse did not have that same type of standing. However, it has elevated themselves. By the way, it all used to be one. It all used to be the consortium of colleges. Clark, it used to be the Atlanta Consortium of Colleges. And then they broke up to where Clark Atlanta University, Spelman University, and Morehouse College, Spelman College. Anyway, so the hierarchy exists within amongst the HBCUs. A lot of this is how, get this, predominantly white institutions evaluate the Black institutions. After you find, after that, after the Civil War, we get into the largest generation that we are still living under when it comes to institutions. And that is post, we have, of course, it's important to note the Merrill Land Grant. Merrill Land Grant was this huge movement to create institutions, public institutions, but this comes in the space of World War II. It's hard to get into, it's hard to have this conversation because it's fascinating, really, in the space that we're in. But um, why this matters is because you also have, Franklin Roosevelt and eventually Truman looked upon education as not as a national security interest, that America was lagging in educating enough of our young people with college degrees. This is, and not just in the math. I mean, of course, the Truman Report comes out. This is when Truman was president, and I have to back up to the land grant, Merrill's land grant, in which it was the thing, and then combine that with the GI Bill. The Merrill Land Grant created state universities all throughout the country, and some of them were HBCUs, but the majority of them are predominantly white institutions. I'll give an example of one, Tennessee State University, land grant institution that's predominantly Black, um, and HBCU. But across the country, you have universities everywhere popping up, and and it was supposed to be the federal government gave money to these institutions to pop up, number one. Number two, it also gave them the land itself. And then you had other states that began to create their own systems. So, give an example, a high example is that um, California, which is where I live, created a the use. We had three major universities: Stanford in the north, USC in the south. The land grant institution became UC Berkeley, and then UC, and then they wanted a big university in the south, and that became UCLA. So we had four main colleges. However, let's put UCLA down, and then let's put USC down. The two that really crafted the foundation of what our university system looks like in California are two, Stanford and UCLA. Stanford was supposed to be the West version of an Ivy League. If you look at the the architecture, it looks just like an Ivy League. It looks more like Harvard than it does anyway. And that was intent. A friend of mine, she wrote a dissertation on that. I'm not going to get into the architecture of it all because that's a whole different topic. Then you had UCLA, but I do want you to know that all of this was the look of the institution is something that is equally as important as what they teach. And then you had UC Berkeley. I misspoke. My bad. UC Berkeley. UC Berkeley's president at the time came from the East Coast and actually is a former Harvard professor. I am skipping over a lot of this, and frankly, this is a class that I would teach. So I'm not really, so there's a lot to unpack here. I could do a whole series of this. even teaching one semester is not enough, but it is a semester class called the History of Higher Ed. Um, anyway, and they came up with the master plan. And the master plan of 1960, um, uh, um, let's the master plan after 1960 decided that the UCLA was going to be the Ivy League of the West and that it became its own regulatory agency of the Cal State and the community colleges. Okay. And the community colleges were founded particularly just for them, for students to come to the UC. And the Cal States was only going to be a regional thing and it was never going to be research based. So they would never offer anything beyond bachelor's degrees and some master's degrees and only with the intent of teaching. Um, so I think that that's important. All of that's important to note, right? Because like I said, there's a tier system that higher education has continually made. We put the Ivy Leagues at this higher top, and the Ivy Leagues is most importantly Harvard had been able to kind of came down and said, okay, wait a second. There's a lot of universities all around the country now, and we got to figure out a way to make sure that some people are able to have a space and that some people are able to have a space to regulate if these colleges are credible or not. And so so they wrote up this concept of regulatory agencies, and regulatory agencies were supposed to be regional. And for the large part, they've stayed regional up until less than a couple years ago, where allowed universities and colleges to seek different regulatory agencies outside of their region. Mind blowing. I don't want to get into that, but because there's also some politics of these regulatory agencies, because it's become what are the characteristics of how do you become accredited? We can also argue what, why is it necessary to be accredited? That's a very legit conversation. And then what's up with the politics of accreditation? So some of the politics of accreditation is really staggering because we could get it because accreditation has been used in order to put some colleges out of business. And why would that happen? Well, it's been manipulated in ways so that you can get the land. And a good one that has been happening is Wilberforce. Wilberforce has always been threatened. Ohio State has always been wanting to, over the years, expand, expand, expand. I mean, right now it's not as in the expansive period, and this is primarily because of Donald Trump. Higher education as a whole is in a constriction experience as because of Donald Trump. But before Donald Trump, it has always been in this expansion period. And one way to expand, and it's always great, is is to take over another college. And Wilberforce has always been the target um, at one point. And so having schools go in and out of accreditation has been one way for predominantly white institutions to swallow up um, HBCUs. But even some of the accreditation requirements is is a bit problematic because all of the because there's a change in rules. And so you may see a school that's been accredited by one agency all of a sudden not accredited by that agency and is now skipped over to a whole nother agency. So I'm not saying, I mean, but again, we have now come to the belief that accreditation is something that allows the degree to have merit. It has been almost peer reviewed. It's peer reviewed. And so it has turned into this thing that everybody knows has a degree and and it had the university or college has met all of these expectations of all these requirements that has been written amongst the academy. And so therefore we know that this degree from this institution is something that is meets the standards across all board. That's the belief. And it's a gatekeeping. It's also a gatekeeping strategy. So some states have now decided to allow, because when I said all of this, I said nothing about trades. And historically, trades have been kicked out of academy and they have been moved towards some HBCUs had trades. They kicked that stuff out because you can't get accreditation with a bunch of trades at your school. So now the question is, where do they go? And they started at the high school. And so now the problem with high school having trades is that, people, that's been a whole nother fight because it was a lawsuit that stemmed from is high school for what is the purpose of high school? And so there's been a huge movement over the last, I would say 20 years, 20, 40 years, that has said that we should be looking at high school to be readying everyone to kind of go to college. And that meant you kick trades out of high school and you have put them into the community college, or you have put them in its own trade school, or you've put them in adult school. Now, community colleges is fascinating because they started off as junior colleges ready for them to go to the UC. But then there was a reform that took place in the 1970s that said, okay, now wait a second, this isn't going to work because not everybody, where does a student go if they don't want to go to college? And so junior college changed to the notion of a community college. And so then you offer all of these other things, and that meant adult education, adult learning, all of the AA degrees. But now we've become in this radical revolution in the last 15 years to where community colleges in some spaces, especially specifically in California, has grown so big and so wide. Like in California, there are 2.2 million students who are in community colleges. And it has grown so big in 116 community colleges to where uh, what do we do with all of these students? And and we know that they're not transferring to the UC, and we know that the Cal State takes a lot of them. But what happens to all of the students who don't necessarily want to go to the Cal State? Is it now possible? So some of these community colleges, and there are some that a Cal State is really kind of far. So why can't we offer bachelor's degrees? Mm. And this has completely shifted higher education in California because the fight is, wait a second, it means you're taking students away from the Cal State if you're offering bachelor's degrees. So now bachelor's degrees that are offered at the community college can only be and things that cannot be found at the community, at the Cal State or the UC, because there should be no competition. But before this fight, it was the Cal States. The Cal States were like, now wait a second, we also want to research. And they're like, research, you can't research. So therefore, the compromise is that you can only have an EDD and then you cannot have a PhD. Now, this gets into the tier. So now we have a tier of schools fighting with each other, right? We also have now a tier of degrees that fight with each other. So I'm gonna get back to that. So now we're back to the community colleges now that services things. Now they've kind of taken over the adult education because we don't have any more trades in high school. Adult education has now been attached to a school district, just like the junior colleges first started off attached to school districts. It's the 1970s that all that broke off. And now they're community colleges with their own district. Great. So now the adult education has been left to do these trades. This is why Cheyenne Bryant enters the mix. States like California, and I'm bringing up California because she went to the school she went to was out here, Argos, Argosy, it's based in California. Here's the thing. Every state has, even if you're not accredited, accreditation is not state bound. Okay. So every state has rules in how you can found a university or college. So, with that being said, we have a school. California is one of the easiest places to find to create a university. I can, if I wanted to, create a university today. It's even easy to start a charter school. Charter schools, you can start one same way as you start at a college. I can start one within 120 days. My doors can open. Crazy. Drop mic. It's crazy. Okay. With that being said, this is a terrible practice because what it means is that you have all of these colleges that start, and this is where people said it's predatory institutions because really I can start one, but it takes a while to get federal funding. And this is where federal funding comes into play. Federal funding does require accreditation. However, it doesn't stipulate what type of accreditation. And so therefore, for-profit institutions have their own accrediting institutions. And their accreditation is a lot lax than the nonprofit. The non there's only, I would say, two for-profit institutions that have been able to make it to the nonprofit. Two. It is extremely difficult. And the difficulty is because of the standards for sure. But it also is because there's a gatekeeping. No nonprofit institution wants somebody to be able to get a degree in a bachelor's degree in a year and a half. Nobody wants you to be able to get it in 2.5. A bachelor's degree in that short amount of time is a problem. And so therefore it leads to some of these other larger issues to where how can we shield people from being able to move into this for profit? But for profit allows people to get a degree quickly. And however, the way that the gatekeeping happens is that if you go to one for profit, you're going to have to stay in the for profit space because Most nonprofit institutions will not take not one of those units. So, your University of Phoenix. So, when you see somebody getting a University of Phoenix degree, the odds are that they're going to be staying in that space. They will never go to another non-profit institution. They're spending way more money on their degree than somebody else, but they wanted to do it quickly. So when you look at the Cheyenne Bryant of it all, the Cheyenne Bryant who went to University of Phoenix, allegedly, I don't know, um, there's already a snub that is being held in regards to, oh, you went to University of Phoenix, meaning one class is 4 weeks, right? And so there's already a snub. And then when you say you went to Argosy, for those who it doesn't even matter, it's already another snub because that also is another for-profit that yields n- no credibility. Even if she were to have gotten her degree from there, it's still a snub because, ew, that school has zero credibility. And then we look at the hierarchy of degrees. So there's a hierarchy within the PhD space of the degrees that are extremely hard, all the way down to the degrees that is perceived to be very, very simple. And even all of those in the PhD space of hierarchy of really hard all the way down to very simple, all of those are still higher than what we would consider an EDD. An EDD is looked upon as a practitioner degree, and we do not think of them as scholars. So there's hierarchy of all of them. And in fact, and the same thing for a DBA, a Doctorate of Business Administration, they're looked upon as someone who is not a person with the PhD who's a scholar. A DBA is a practitioner degree for business administration. A DPA, Doctor of Public Administration, that's still perceived as someone who is not as scholarly. So there's a hierarchy between the top, so much so that some schools will not hire people with these degrees. Doesn't matter where they went, they just won't. Um, so there's been movement over the years that people will hire them to be even, college presidents. It was like maybe 15 years ago that the first time that a Cal State hired somebody with the EDD as a president. Um, People just do not think of them as in the same, because their degree doesn't have the same perceived rigor as someone with a PhD. So a PhD is definitely more valuable. And I'm going to say this about a psych PhD, that as someone who has not held a psych PhD, however, I had to take as a transdisciplinary, I had to take some psych. I took one psych class in the psych program, and I'm going to tell you that the psych professors, when it comes to admission, is some of the most brutal when it comes to admission practice. They do not think, they do not think that the degree should be easy to get into. They don't even think it should be mid to get into. They think it is extremely difficult. The amount of math that's in psych is insane. It is very math intensive. It is very difficult to uh, be able to make it to your qual exams. The grading is extremely hard. It is extremely tenuous versus I think political science is not, I wouldn't say there's a lot of math, but I will say about political science is that we tend to have a lot more reading. Our reading is extremely intensive. The writing is extremely intensive. But psych, so I can understand why she's lying about psych because but I can also understand as somebody who has a PhD, and I can also understand as these people who have a psych PhD, there's a difference. There's a difference between having a PhD in psychology and between a psych D. One is more of a practitioner's degree, one is not, but it doesn't matter. Both of them are very difficult to obtain. And to say that one has that and you really didn't is just out of this world. But there is a difference between having an EDD educational psychology degree than having a Psych D degree and having a PhD in psychology. All three are different rigor, and the EDD of ed psychology is absolutely the less of the three. Does not have as much math. It does not take as long. The dissertation is not as it's not as much of a difficult process. I mean, that's the biggest beef that PhDs have with EDDs is that you're writing your dissertation, you're starting it in the first semester. Whereas somebody who has a PhD, there's no way that you have to do your coursework first and then your quals, and then you do it, a dissertation defense. You have to do not a dissertation defense. There's so many. You do your quals, and then you have to write a proposal, and then you have to defend your proposal, and then you have to, like, there's so many steps that all of this is offensive to his face. But it's also the Cheyenne Bryant story leads to this larger discussion of gatekeeping of higher ed, number one. And then the second part, it leads to a bigger discussion on um, the stigmas within higher ed and how judgmental we are about what school you went to, how you obtain your degree. All of that is stratified within the system. So I think that that's, important to grasp and understand. My apologies. I anticipated this to be a 20-minute video. It's turned into a longer video. My apologies, but like I said, this is actually two classes put into a short little span of time. If you have questions about different things, you can put in the chat and then I can consider doing a video more in depth on a topic that you're interested in if it's pertaining to any of this. But at the end of the day, you know, I I do I am fascinated at how many people are entering this conversation because because there's so much to unpack and I can really, and it's so much to unpack by people who may not have gone through the process. And higher education in the United States is really complicated and it's done so on purpose. That being said, I'm going to bid adieu because I've skipped a lot, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of a taste. Have a great night.